My name is David Scudder of the class of '57, and I'm here to introduce our very distinguished classmate Malcolm Wiener over on my left here. Malcolm has had an extraordinarily varied and extraordinarily distinguished career. A graduate of both the college and the law school, he practiced first as an attorney, but then founded several investment management firms. After retiring from that business, he elected to become a world-famous scholar. His field is the study of Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean civilizations, Greece and its environs. He has published many papers on the field. He has been awarded 7 honorary degrees for his work in classical studies. He has received awards from the school in Athens and from quite a number of American universities. On top of that, he has published papers on economics, foreign affairs, antiquities law, and Picasso. He is a trustee emeritus of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He is chairman emeritus of the American School in Athens. And he is the founder of the Malcolm Wiener Center at Harvard's Kennedy School. He and his wife, Carolyn, have 4 children, one of whom is graduating tomorrow, right there, and and another who is a first-year law school student. His topic is climate change, famines, pandemics, and warfare in the collapse of civilizations. Perhaps quite a dose at this early a time in the morning. But I think we're going to be instructed, I think we're going to be entertained, and I think we're going to learn a great deal. Malcolm Wiener.
Thank you, dear friend and classmate. I feel greatly honored by your invitation to speak this morning. In fact, coming over, I said to my wife, Carolyn, did you ever imagine, even in your wildest dreams, that at the age of 82, I would be asked to be one of my class speakers? To which she replied, my dear, at the age of 82, you no longer appear in my wildest dreams. I thought I might start off our reunion celebration day with a cheerful talk on the collapse of civilizations. Let me begin with a quick romp through climate history and then focus on what seems to me to be a clear case of climate change leading to the collapse of civilizations between 2300 and 2000 BC. Around 1200 BC, the ice sheets, which covered much of the northern hemisphere, including what is now Harvard Yard, retreated. It was, by any standard, a major climate event. Around 6000 BC, a major change in rainfall patterns caused what had been a savanna in Africa to begin contracting, forcing humans in North Africa to move to the banks of the Nile with its life-sustaining river water. Between about 2300 and 2000 BC, rain slacked markedly in an area stretching from at least the Indus Valley to Spain, with the attendant collapse of civilizations I shall describe today. Then came a period of better climate, and with it Aegean civilizations, first at Minoan Crete and then Mycenaean Greece, complete with palaces, plumbing, and the advent of writing. At the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200, 1100 BC, adverse climate may have been a factor in the collapse of the Egyptian New Kingdom, Hittite Empire in Anatolia, modern Turkey, and Mycenaean Greece. In Egypt and Anatolia, there is abundant evidence for famine and plague in the preceding centuries, and there is much evidence for warfare at this time. There followed the glory that was classical Greece and the grandeur of Rome. With regard to the end of the Roman Empire, the work of the Science of the Human Past Initiative here at Harvard, led by our great medievalist and Romanist, Professor Michael McCormick, and leading geneticist, Professor David Reich at the Harvard Medical School, has illuminated the role of adverse climate, due perhaps in part to volcanic eruptions known to have occurred in AD 535 and early 536, and again in 539, 540, whose aerosols obscured the sun. Famine induced by highly unsettled weather of the 6th century AD likely spurred the migrations and invasions of the Huns and had been a factor in the deadly impact of the Justinianic plague of AD 541, 543. Recently, DNA analysis has disclosed that the plague of Justinian was exactly the same strain of bubonic plague as the Black Death, which ravaged Europe between AD 1347 and 1351. A recent study by Harvard alumnus Kyle Harper concludes that the expansive possibilities of gene sequencing are enabling historians to trace deep transformations in human health and disease in ways that were previously unconceivable. Accumulated skeletal evidence has shown that the Romans were short in stature, unimpressive relative to their Iron Age predecessors and Dark Age successors. For the Romans, the heavy burden of infectious disease drained their bodies' metabolic resources and stunted their growth. In any event, the period known as the Roman warming, which began about 200 BC, came to an end and was followed by the Dark Cold Ages from AD 600 to 950. The Dark Cold Ages were followed by the medieval climate anomaly, or medieval warm period, when grapes grew as far north as Maine. Next came the Little Ice Age of AD 1550 to 1750, marked by prolonged freezing winters and colder, damper summers in at least much of Europe and China, when famines were common. Population collapse occurred in Germany, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, England, Poland, Castile, and Catalonia. Smallpox, plague, typhus, and measles attacked many already weakened by starvation. Population may have been reduced by a third. Intensive warfare followed, taking still more lives. In the 17th century AD, the canals and ponds of the Netherlands froze over, as one may observe in Dutch Golden Age paintings of hundreds of figures engaged in various activities on ice, for example, in the works of Hendrik Averkamp, including the one on view across the street. Conversely, warming climate beginning in the last half of the 18th century was accompanied by population increase. With that sprint through the history of major episodes of climate change, let us turn to a consideration of the collapse of civilizations between about 2300 and 2000 BC. Fortunately, today we have access to fields of knowledge which would have been inconceivable when we were undergraduates, and indeed, in some cases, even a decade ago. These include DNA analysis of the genes of humans, animals, and pathogens, strontium isotope analysis of diets at various stages of life via analysis of bones from burials, and climate proxies such as ice cores, the tree rings of long-lived trees, such as the oaks of the Rhine River Valley or the bristlecone and foxtail pines in the mountain ranges of California and Arizona, stalagmites and sediments from seas and lakes, and the discoveries of archaeologists and archaeological scientists using new techniques of excavating, imaging, and recording. Let us begin in Egypt, where, as we noted, people settled along the banks of the Nile with its life-giving water. Not long after 2300 BC, however, the Nile water flow was sharply diminished, resulting in famine. The tomb of a southern Egyptian provincial governor of around 2100 BC contained an inscription carved in the rock describing starvation caused by Nile failure, dislocation, and the breakdown of order. The river of Egypt is empty, it reads. Men cross over the river on foot. The Egyptian Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, dissolved, not to recover fully until around 2000 BC, when the Nile floods returned and the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, with its grand temples, palaces, and sculpture, was formed. Contrary to the romantic view that the Nile River flows almost entirely from the blue waters of Lake Victoria, in fact, about 93% of the Nile waters come from mountains originating in the come from monsoons originating in the Indian Ocean, which sweep up the Nile Valley. Various bodies of geological evidence indicate that these life-sustaining monsoons failed to appear or were severely diminished for roughly 2 centuries. We should also note in this regard the roughly simultaneous collapse of the Indus Valley civilization, with its large urban complexes at sites such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, a civilization employing massive drainage works. By the 18th century BC, texts speak of the arrival of conquering Indo-European-speaking warriors on horseback, but this migration may mark the end of the saga, not its origin. Moving farther north, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. The climate aspect of the collapse was first noted in 1982 by Professor Harvey Weiss at Yale, who, in his excavations at the site of Tel Eilan in the Habur River Valley of northernmost Syria, noticed a huge dust level containing no sign of human occupation. Professor Weiss proposed a causal major climate event with dramatic consequences, stating that, quote, societies responded to the abrupt climate change with political collapse, regional abandonment, nomadization, and habitat tracking to sustainable agricultural regions. Harvey Weiss's proposal was initially greeted with great skepticism, some excavators replying that in this period they saw no abandonment, but rather an increase in population at their Akkadian Empire sites. The pattern now seems clear, however. Sites which had access to the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers grew in population, along with a few sites adjacent to karst-fed springs, whereas sites dependent on rainfall agriculture were abandoned. Indeed, we have texts from Mesopotamian sites complaining about the arrival of peoples from the west and north who said they had no water. Walls were built across Syria facing western Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and also facing north. Known respectively as the Tres Longs Murs and the Repeller of the Amorites, referring to a people speaking in Northwest Semitic dialect. A text of the succeeding Assyrian Empire speaks of the 17 Amorite kings who lived in tents during the interregnum. In any event, the walls failed to halt the movement of the Amorites. Whether this has any relevance to a certain current proposal, I leave to others. I'll speak in a few moments about the interconnectedness of major climate events, famines, migrations, warfare, and pandemics. But perhaps it is worth pausing briefly here to recall that recent crop failures and the loss of an estimated 80% of the livestock in areas of modern Syria between 2006 and 2009 are said to have led to migrations and unrest, sparking the brutal conflict and humanitarian disaster still unfolding. Returning to 2200 BC, farther northwest in Anatolia, the Ark of Destruction included Troy, where the great walls of Troy II-III, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann, fell into ruin, and Troy IV suffered 6 destruction levels. The inhabited area shrank drastically. Surrounding smaller sites disappeared, along with evidence of external contacts, and signs of stress on barley crops appeared. faunal remains indicate an altered diet containing a significant percentage of deer and other non-domesticates. Sites in Cilicia and the central Taurus mountain range and to the east across the Taurus range at Kultepe were abandoned as well. In Canaan, a decrease in rainfall beginning around 2300 BC and resulting in the creation of the wadis still visible today has been proposed as a cause of the precipitous decline in the number of inhabited sites. West of the Jordan and the Dead Sea, not a single site has been found that survived the collapse, while a few sites survived in the stream-fed northern Levant. In Cyprus, the Philia culture of the early Bronze Age disintegrated. Moving west, we come to the Cycladic islands of the Aegean Sea into Greece. In mainland Greece, the early Bronze II culture, marked by large buildings such as the House of Tiles at Lerna, named for its roof tiles, and the Rundbau at Tiryns, both with evidence of administration in the form of seal impressions, mostly applied to doors whenever food was removed, disappeared, and along with evidence of contacts of sites in Anatolia and elsewhere in what has been called an international age. In a wave of destructions, accompanied by a radical decrease in the number of occupied sites. The dramatic differences in the types of cooking pottery before and after indicate a change in the method of food preparation and perhaps of diet as well. The period of the destructions also marks the first appearance of the horse in Greece, perhaps used by warriors on horseback. In the Cycladic islands, many sites are abandoned or destroyed, and the culture marked by the famed Cycladic marble figurines, which inspired works by Moore, Brancusi, and Picasso, among others, disappears by 2000 BC. Some islands, such as Kea, were simply deserted for centuries. On others, fortifications were built on hilltops, only to suffer violent destructions. At Panormos on Naxos, the largest and most fertile Cycladic island, and the source of the marble for the idols, the end was surely violent, to judge from the burnt entrance and slingstones and spearheads found in the debris. The arc of upheaval extended farther west as well, for the temple culture of Malta and the metallurgical culture of Rio Tinto in Spain, which flourished from about 3000 to 2000 BC, also came to a sudden end, with the apparent arrival of new and less developed cultures in both areas. It is worth noting that the direction of regional abandonments appears to have moved from east to west over the time, beginning in the Cabo River Valley early in the 23rd century. So much for our brief survey of the collapse of civilizations between 2300 and 2000 BC. Climate change, probably attributable to the failure of the Indian Ocean monsoons, and perhaps the interruption as well of the westerly cyclones originating in North Africa, which normally sweep across the Mediterranean, was undoubtedly a major factor in the collapse, including famine-induced migrations, frequently resulting in the destruction of sites and societies. After all, if you're starving to death and your children are starving to death, you have a pretty binary choice. You can either move and try to take over the agricultural land of others or starve. We should also note at this time the first appearance of significant numbers of bronze weapons in many areas, and in the Aegean, the first appearance of sailing vessels in place of oared longboats, which may have brought not only raiders but also pathogens to which local populations had no immunity. Here is the first depiction of a sailing vessel in the Aegean Sea from a Minoan Cretan seal of about 2000 BC, and here is an Egyptian sailing vessel of the time. An Egyptian text from around 2300 BC, shortly before the collapse of the Old Kingdom, contains a description of the first recorded amphibious assault in human history. The Pharaoh of Egypt receives the report that pirates located in the vicinity of Gaza, the more things change, the more they stay the same, in modern Palestine have seized an Egyptian ship returning from Byblos with the prized cedars of Lebanon. And rather than attempt to march an army all the way to Gaza with all the necessary supplies, the pharaoh ordered instead the troops be placed on ships to attack the pirate lair, thereby inventing the Marine Corps. Finally, what lessons, if any, does this episode provide for the current heated climate debate? I just couldn't resist that double entendre. Here, views differ. Climate change doubters have hailed my paper, saying, see, climate can change in unpredictable and unpreventable ways, having absolutely nothing to do with hydrocarbon emissions. On the other hand, when I presented a summary of my findings at Dickinson College, Lisa Jackson, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency in the first term of the Obama administration, rushed up to me as soon as I had finished, embraced me in her large arms, and said, this is marvelous. You've shown how devastating climate change can be. And while in those days people would have thought the absence of rain was a sign that they had angered the gods, today we know what causes climate change and we can do something about it. As so often in life, it seems that what one sees depends on where one stands. Thank you very much.
Now, I am sure that Malcolm would enjoy having some questions, and I'm sure this fascinating talk can inspire a number of questions. Let me also note that after the question period, we're going to ask Charlie Stedman, our classmate, to come up here and give a little talk about the essay book. But who has a question?
Please.
Now, are there different etiologies for these two kinds of phenomena or
not? Yeah. The question involved the fact that it seemed from my talk as though there were periods in history where climate change lasted over a long period and others where it seemed to be briefer. And that raised in turn the question of whether there might be different causes. I think I've got that right. This is a science in its infancy. Believe it or not, and the last 5 years have seen a total revolution in our understanding of the peopling of the Earth and many aspects. For example, in DNA analysis, we were learning astonishing things. With regard to climate, I changed this paper as recently as last night because I happened to be reading reports from 3 different areas based on intense study of tree rings. As I mentioned, there are certain areas in the world, fortunately not all areas, where you have very well-behaved trees that put on 1 ring each year. And you can study those individual tree rings and see what happened on an annual basis. Unfortunately, this doesn't apply in Greece, where we just have olive trees which don't live very long and don't make regular annual rings. But what we've discovered is that there seem to have been 2 major volcanic eruptions following one right after another that had significant effects. I mentioned the years, I think, 535, early 536, and 540, 541. We know from records that 550 was a terribly cold year. There were reports all over Europe of people freezing in poor climate. So you may have specific events. The volcanic eruptions and the aerosols, in that case, may have been relevant. So you may have short-lived events. On the other hand, you have these events that seemingly cover centuries, with the impact differing in various places. The other thing that should be noted is that major volcanic events have very different effects, sometimes 30 miles apart. When Tambora went up in 1815, the next year, 1816, I think, was known as the year without a summer in certain areas, even in New England, where there was freezing. And yet, one site might have been utterly destroyed by freezing weather, and a site 30 miles away, not much affected. So the pattern, is never exactly uniform. It all depends on what kind of event set off set off the consequences and whether there were consequences to that event. For example, if the climate change led to starvation, did that lead to violent migration? That so weakened the population that it made it easy for pandemics to flourish. And we have evidence of that. So it's always an interconnection of factors. And then there's always the human response. The first, the published version of this big paper was called The Interaction of Human Agency in Climate Change and the Collapse of Civilizations. For example, in the case of the Maya, where there was a very significant climate event, as there were several that won in the 9th century, it looks at certain sites as though instead of doing what we would regard as the rational thing, which is to try to improve the dikes and the flow of water, people were actually removed from the fields and there was an orgy of temple building. It seems as though the people affected thought they'd angered the gods, and instead of improving the dikes and the water drainage, they should build temples, you know. So one always has to think about the possibility of human irrationality and misbehavior in response to adverse conditions. It's much too simple, as some people do, you know, to say climate change, civilization collapse, let's do something about climate. One has to think about the interplay of various forces. Yes,
We have a mic now here.
Well, anybody reading Science magazine even 30 years ago would learn that things can change very rapidly on scales of tens of years, but you may or may not know that the ice in Greenland, if it were to float, even not necessarily even melt, about 18 feet of sea level rise. There's another 18 feet tied up in the West Antarctic ice shelf, which is possibly unstable now. And okay, so things are a little scary, and I've had a pet project for a number of decades. I'm not the first person to think about it, but 5 million years ago, the Atlantic dropped below the sill at Gibraltar. The net inflow of rivers into the Mediterranean is less than the evaporation, and so over a period of time, a kind of Death Valley, 10,000 feet deep, formed there with deep canyons at the Rhone and the Nile, and salt flats on the bottom. It's well established that this happened, and it might have been rather fun to be there when the sea level rose up again and a spectacular waterfall refilled the Mediterranean. But to get to the point, the pet project is the Straits of Gibraltar are only about 9 miles across, and for a few tens of billions of dollars, it might be a great investment to dam the straits up so that when the seas rise, as they will, you protected the sea level inside the Mediterranean. What do you think of this?
Well, of course, it's way beyond my competence. My engineering skills are between 0 and minus something. But as you were speaking, I thought of some recent work going on in Crete, which is suggesting that you have Acheulean-type tools that somehow people occupied Crete in 1,300 BC, in 130,000 BC, and that they somehow made the voyage by sea. And I've raised the question, how do we know that the Straits of Gibraltar at that time might not have been so narrow or so crossable that they actually crossed there and sort of island hopped the rest of the way? I wouldn't automatically assume great seafaring skills by our pre-Homo sapiens predecessors, because we don't know what the land looked like then. One normally thinks in terms of the maps one memorized in childhood, but we should remember, as you're pointing out, that it was not always this way as to whether it's feasible to block the waters flowing from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. I don't have a clue. I'll take your word for that.
Do we have another over there? Yes.
Oh, yeah, you haven't talked about population growth and the effects of overpopulating an area on the climate and on the land and on migrations. Do you want to add anything about population or overgrowth of populations so that the people simply have to leave because they've wrecked their environment?
Yeah. Well, of course, sustainability is always a question of the relationship between the population, the amount of food available. And we've seen enormous population shifts because of lack of food. I mean, the history of, in my terms, recent history was drastically changed by the great bubonic plague that affected Europe between, well, the key years were 1347 and 51, but there were subsequent developments, outbreaks, so that the population may have been cut by half, and it completely changed the relationship between agricultural workers and their lords. So the workers suddenly became much more valuable, you know, and we had then coming the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, but there have been enormous population shifts caused by the availability of food, among other factors. Today, of course, with modern farming, if we had world peace and supplies were distributed fairly, we could feed the Earth's population as it now stands, you know. But that's a big if, and of course there are plenty of people in the world starving today. I should say, disgracefully many people in the world starving today.
How do you interlace your theories with those of Jared Diamond, who is in the class behind us, who really places more emphasis on human activities in causing land to become barren rather than having climate change be the primary force? They seem to be almost complementary, but yet need interlacing.
Well, as I mentioned, you know, one should make allowance for the importance of human stupidity in various circumstances. You know, where we don't have texts, you know, going way back, it's harder to measure. In the Mayan case, as I said, one suspects that had something to do with it. I thought Jared's book, which sold amazingly, was very useful in bringing attention to problems. In terms of his analysis of particular situations, whether it was Easter Island or the Mayas or anything else, well, let's say much less was known then. So one should make allowance and look at the more recent literature.
If I understood you correctly, these great climatic changes are really related to massive atmospheric pollution. Is that right?
Pollution, did you say?
Pollution, atmosphere, volcanoes and things like that.
Well, that's one cause. The cause of the major event I spent most of my time describing, because I've recently studied it, and it's something new, between 2300 and 2000 BC, does seem to have been caused, at least in part, by something that happened in the Indian Ocean, where, you know, everything going west, the rains just stopped. Curiously, you know, everything goes viral these days instantly. I published my paper in a joint issue of two leading but rather obscure journals, leading journals in their field, Radiocarbon and the Journal of Tree Ring Research, for accidental reasons they asked for. Within one day, I had an email from the vice chair of the Academy of Sciences in Beijing saying, I hope you realize the same thing happened in China. When can you come to lecture? By this, he meant that the Longshan culture in China collapsed. But it may have been for the opposite reason. Again, climate scientists are just beginning to look at this, but it looks as though in the Indian Ocean monsoons, which play such a significant role around the world, the western branch stopped. It didn't produce enough rain. Whereas things shifted to the east, and the sites in China may have been drowned in water. But we're just at early days looking at that, you know.
My question was going to be that the changes that the changes that produce your subject matter, and the order of magnitude of those changes, how does that compare with the order of magnitude of the kind of changes that society currently worries about as man-made climatic change? Are they, what's the relationship in the orders of magnitude?
Yeah. Thank you. I wasn't very clear. What I was trying to say is that with regard to the past, there are very different kinds of changes. The volcanic eruptions putting up aerosols are, relatively short-lived, but they could have dreadful effects. They could lead to wars and, God knows what. Whereas the change I was speaking about between 2300 and 2000 BC was longer-lived and much wider spread. With regard, you're really raising the question of the extent to which human activity is contributing to climate change today. As I said, a heated point of discussion about which I can't claim any particular expertise. The last 20 years have been alarming, of course. They've been a very warm period. Will this continue or will it stop? Some people think we're about due for another ice age, but nobody can predict that. As to the extent to which hydrocarbons and human activity are causing or increasing this, I think they're having some effect, but I don't know the magnitude of it. And nor do I know what will happen if we continue on our present course for another 50 years, but it frightens me, and I wouldn't. And there's another factor to consider, and that is that there are other reasons for getting rid of hydrocarbons and moving to electrical cars and renewable energy. First of all, there's the pollution effect. I live in New York and Greenwich, Connecticut, and when the Chinese shut down their power plants at the time of the Beijing Olympics, the air quality in New York City improved dramatically. And we know it has this effect. So I'd like to, make the air breathable. I just think of the people in Beijing. I was born in China, and I spent some time there, and I just look at the reports with horror. And the Chinese are aware of this, and I've said to Chinese leaders, this is both a literal and a figurative loss of face, because people have to go around with their faces covered in Beijing. You have to do something about this, and they're keenly aware of it. They're doing it, but every time they try to shut down those plants, they have riots, and so they're between a rock and a hard place. But it's not because they're not aware of the problem. The other advantage of getting away from hydrocarbons is we'd be sending much less of our wealth to Saudi Arabia and to Russia. Countries which don't always use the wealth to the advantage of the world, So I would certainly move, let's say, more rapidly than the current administration seems likely to do, to try to get away from a world of hydrocarbons. But I think anybody who says that they can predict exactly what's going to happen in 20 or 40 years' time is ahead of the science. There are just too many chance factors. We don't know exactly, but life is tough. You have to sometimes make difficult choices in circumstances of uncertainty. Those of our many classmates who have been involved in investment and financial markets are quite aware of this. So my bet would be to do something.
Yes. There's another question over there.
You spoke of the 1816 event and the year without a summer, and the 1816 event is kind of the model for what a lot of people are proposing in geoengineering. Let's do 1816 again. That will help us quite a lot. I just wonder, how long term? Was it really just that 1 year? And what can we learn about the possibility of blowing up more volcanoes to cool the Earth?
Well, I've heard of the nuclear option, but the volcanic option is a new one on me. What strikes me, and I spent some time, maybe 30 years ago, going through all the records of Tambora, as I said earlier, for one thing, how varied the effects were, even at sites fairly close to one another. It all depended on how the wind was going and so on. And some places it was following year was the year without a summer, and horrible other places seemingly not so affected at all. In some places, I suppose, there were some continuing effects. Usually, you know, if you're talking about volcanic eruptions, the direct effects are over within a year or two, but it may set in train, you know, abandonment of areas or starvation. Of course, the people immediately around the site of the eruption are affected. But the question comes if you have two major volcanic eruptions within 5 years, it seems to have occurred in the late Roman Empire, whether you know whether the effects might mark a tipping point. It really depends where the society is when you have a volcanic eruption. You know, if their grain reserves of the prior years have been good, if the society is coherent, it'll shrug off the effects mostly, and if not, not. You know, fragile societies will be much more affected than strong and stable ones.
Would you comment about these long-term ice ages? You call them natural causes. The first ice age, the second ice age. Now, what were these natural causes that brought about these various ice ages?
Yeah, of course, this is a difficult question, and I don't claim to be an astronomer or expert on weather. I think the most common theory advanced is that it has to do with perturbations of the sun, either, of the relationship of the sun and Earth, the relation of the Earth's orbit to the sun, or alternatively into sunspot cycles. We do think there are sunspot cycles, and in fact, some people have been predicting a cycle that will cause the Earth to cool. But, you know, the prediction, it's usually added sometime within the next few hundred years, which isn't necessarily reassuring, you know. But, you know, knowing what happened 1,300 years ago in the universe, maybe even that may even be beyond the wonders of current science, you know. Not entirely clear, I think.
Well, I think we all want to thank Malcolm very much for a splendid talk.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to ask Charlie Stedman to come up here and address us.
Thank you, Malcolm. That was terrific. I remember the days when we were together in NROTC, and it's great. Can you hear me okay? Is this better? Maybe they can turn the volume up somewhere. Okay. Before I talk about the book, let me just tell you something that I think was amusing. Back when I was on the Crimson, one night I was working late up there waiting for the paper to go to bed, and I picked up the bound volume of the 1951 Harvard Crimson. And in November that year, I discovered that they published not one but two parodies of the Yale Daily News during the Yale-Harvard football weekend. And in the second of the two parodies, they had an article which was the supposed reaction of Yale students to the parody the previous day. And one alleged student allegedly said, "I knew it was a fake right away. It felt funny when I used it." So much for the Yale Daily News. You probably already heard too much about the book, but what I want to do is give you just a few snippets, just a tiny sampling of some of the great essays that are in the book. As we know, Chairman Mao had his little red book, and Omar Gaddafi had his little green book. Now we have our great big crimson book. This is a book of, by, and for the Harvard class of 1957. And it's quite something. I've read about 100 of the essays already, and they're delightful. And I think you will find that you are amused, saddened, impressed, dumbfounded, maybe angry when you read them. They're all over the place. They're profound thoughts and less profound thoughts by all our not all our classmates. 135 classmates have written. And whether you contributed or not, I think you will enjoy it. One of the things that really impressed me is the service that we as a class provided. Service to the nation, service to our fellow citizens, fellow Americans by educators, and we had a ton of educators, doctors, we had a ton of doctors, lawyers, and others. Service to nonprofit organizations, and last but not least, service to Harvard. John Dowling, who's an exemplar of this service, has written a piece in the book giving a detailed account of just how much we classmates have contributed to the administration of our alma mater. One of the amazing things is how many of us served in the military. I think that because we grew up our early years were during the Second World War, we felt a strong obligation to do our part, and I think we certainly did. One of my favorite stories in the book is by Rod Wolf, who ended up becoming regular Navy. He was NROTC with us. He went regular Navy, became a member in part of the nuclear submarine fleet. He commanded a nuclear submarine and retired as a captain. And when we approached him for writing a piece, he wrote me back and said how honored and pleased he was. He said no one had ever asked him to write down what he experienced in the Navy. And he was so proud, is so proud of having been one of those who protected us during the Cold War by manning a nuclear submarine under the sea. Anyway, he talks in his essay about joining the nuclear sub-program. He was already in the sub-program, but he wanted to get nuclear because he was told if you ever want to be a skipper in a sub, you're going to have to go nuclear. And he had to be interviewed by Admiral Hyman Rickover, which was a daunting prospect, as you all know. And Rickover had in his office a group of naval officers known as PCOs, prospective commanding officers, whom he was grooming to take over in subs. And they tutored and mentored guys like Rod, who were just trying to get into the program. And his PCO told him, he said, Rod, he said, when Rickover asks you a question, be sure you answer the question he asked. And Rod said, what am I, in first grade I have to have simplistic instructions like this? So he went in to see Admiral Rickover, and Admiral Rickover said, Wolf, how many hours a week do you spend studying outside of class? And Rod said, Admiral, I spend 2 or 3 hours a night studying. And Rickover blew up, and he jumped all over the PCO, and he said, why didn't you tell him to answer the question I asked? And of course, he asked how many hours per week, and Rod said how many hours per day. Then he talks about his first, he was a junior officer on his first nuclear sub, and they were going from Newport up to the North Pole to rendezvous with another sub coming from Hawaii, going up the other side to the North Pole. They were going to rendezvous in an open area of free of ice at the North Pole. And as they were getting close to the pole and they were under the ice pack, Rod was asleep in his bunk, and suddenly the collision alarm went off. And there was a leak in the sub. You're going to have to read and see what happens. There's an amusing story by Jim Eilberg, who was a Navy supply officer stationed in Newport, and in August of 1962, he was ordered to report to the USS Joseph Kennedy because the president and his family and aides wanted to come up to watch the America's Cup races. So Jim reported, and Caroline was 5 years old at the time, and John was only 1, and he said that they gave the security officers fits because they were running all over the ship. And Jim noted that Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, they had 2 lunches on board. The president and the more senior people were in the officer's wardroom for lunch, and the journalists and less senior people were back aft on what they call the O1 level, the deck above the main deck, for lunch. And he said he was pretty sure that Pierre Salinger had a nice lunch in the wardroom and then bolted back to have a second lunch back aft. But at 8 p.m. the night before the final race, he was at home with his wife, and he got a call from a captain who was the assistant naval attaché to the president. And the captain said, Eilberg, he said, Caroline loves the way your father is piped aboard the destroyer by a bosun in a bosun's pipe. He said, please find, she's going to have 7 little friends coming aboard tomorrow. Please find 8 bosun's pipe to give them at 8 p.m. the night before. And Jim knew that there were not enough in the ship's store, but he also knew a friend who had an Army-Navy store who was willing to open his store at 9 p.m. that night and give Jim 8 bosun's pipes so that Caroline and her friends could have it. There's other kinds of public service, not military, but the equivalent that some of our classmates performed. Jim Gale is one sterling example. He joined the Public Health Service as start of his medical career. Less than 6 months later, he found himself on a team tracking down an outbreak of pneumonic plague, which is apparently even more serious than the bubonic plague that was just mentioned here, in a remote village in Bolivia. How did they get there? Well, they flew to La Paz. Then there was a flight from La Paz to a remote town. And then there was an 8-hour truck drive. And then there was a 3-day donkey ride up the eastern slopes of the Andes to the village. The village had 31 inhabitants. When they got there, 27 were dead. The others had fled. But they were able to excavate a grave and apparently get a finger of one of the dead inhabitants and take it back. And that was within 6 months of joining the Public Health Service. Ed Rold also joined the Public Health Service, and he did some fascinating work with much more senior, famous colleagues in Pakistan and North Africa, and that's one you'll want to read. Our class produced a large number of distinguished doctors and lawyers, many of whom did military service in their profession. And some wrote essays with concern about their successors in their fields. David Becker, for example, worries about legal education in his piece, and he's concerned that law students today are not learning the essential problem-solving skills that his generation learned, and that many cannot write clearly or effectively. Bob Neer has a very interesting piece. He was a doctor, talks about the vast changes in medical practice and education that have occurred in the last 60 years, not all of them for the better. One of the things that he regrets is that the way things happen today, patients are not kept in the wards for several days so that doctors circulating among them can get to know them and get to talk to them on several days and really understand what their conditions and what their problems are. That just doesn't happen anymore. We have a number of distinguished journalists in the class. Bernie Gewirtzman comes to mind quickly. Bernie went to China with Nixon just the way Nick Platt did. He also went along with Kissinger on his shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. Bob Lenzner has a very interesting piece where he found that Wall Street is more concentrated today than in any time in U.S. history. And Bob concludes that its institutions are too big to manage, too big to regulate, and too opaque for the press, public, and even their regulators to comprehend. Victor McElhenney has a fascinating piece where he walks us through, he became a science reporter. Really, when the atomic bomb, the Castle Bravo blast in 1954, when we were in college, alerted him to the fact that science was going to be a really important part of our lives, and he became a science reporter starting in Charlotte. And he walks us through the fascinating evolutions in science that have occurred since we graduated. In the book, arts and music are well represented as well. Bob Freeman wrote about our country's symphony orchestras and the challenges that they face. Sam Sachs writes that at the age of 26, he became the chief curator of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, where he had begun selling postcards in the museum shop at night. And later, of course, he was the museum head in Detroit Institute of Arts and the Frick Collection in New York. We produce so many distinguished university professors as well as experts in secondary education. You'll just have to discover them for yourselves. Finally, the book is, or before I do that, the book is full of fascinating personal recollections about that deserve to be more widely known. Just last night, I was talking to John Stein, and I didn't know him in college, and I never would have understood how he got here, how he got to become a member of the class of 1957. And he writes a fascinating essay about his family's flight from Vienna in 1938. At the age of 3, he suddenly realized that his parents and other adults were getting very concerned about something. He didn't know what it was. It took him a while to realize what it was. And his father, who was a dental surgeon, somehow managed to get out of Vienna and eventually back to the United States a huge amount of family furniture and possessions, including his dental chairs. And then when it came time to leave, it was a month before Kristallnacht. And from Vienna, rather than going away from Berlin, they went to Berlin on a train. Then from Berlin to Denmark, from Denmark to Sweden, and from Sweden to London, and from London eventually the United States. But John says that the remarkable thing as he looks back at it is that in his family, in later years, this harrowing flight through Nazi Germany was never a topic for discussion. Gottfried Brieger tells us what it was like to be bombed by the Allies in Berlin, to take refuge in a country town, to then flee on foot as the Soviet army approached, and return to the town which had been destroyed, where one bartered for scraps of food. Amazing stories, absolutely amazing. And we think the barriers that existed for some of our classmates to be able to get here and join us. Al Williams has a fantastic story, and wasn't he great the other night? He was just fantastic. Charles King has a similar story. And Paul Scher, we're very honored to be the classmates of Paul Scher, who was the first blind person to graduate from Harvard College. He acknowledges that Helen Keller got there ahead of him, but she graduated from Radcliffe. And you'll be amazed when you read Paul's essay at what he's done, what he's accomplished, where he's been over the years. When he got to the Grand Canyon, he leaned his head out over the canyon just to get a sense of the vast expanse of the canyon. Finally, let me just say that two classmates played extremely important roles in national events that have resonance today. Earl Silbert writes about a crucial dilemma that he faced as the initial Watergate prosecutor in the fall of '72, before the elections of '72, which resonates with what is happening right now. And in '75, Fritz Schwartz was the chief counsel of the Senate committee chaired by Senator Church that investigated America's intelligence agencies at the age of 40. Finally, don't miss Fred Seidel's poems, and don't miss Herb Wyman's revelation of how 3 pigs were let loose on the Yale Bowl gridiron in 1955 at the Harvard-Yale game, to the consternation, this was at halftime, to the consternation of the Yale band that was trying to perform, and the groundskeepers who were trying to capture the pigs but couldn't, and every time they crossed the goal line, the crowd cheered. Herb says there was suspicion that the Lampoon was involved, and you'll have to read it to find out. No, they weren't greased, but they were slippery as heck. Anyway, thank you. I think you'll really enjoy the book.
Just one last word. The essay book, you can buy extra copies if you want. We need to know for the printing size, if you want to have 4 or 5 for your family, please sign up at the registration desk, and it's $70 a book, and well worth it, every word.